on Lessons in Leadership, we are Andre Kerr, a partner at XPS and head of the investment team at Leeds. Andre, great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
First question I ask everybody when we do these is, can you tell us a little bit about your career history and how you've got to where you are today, so that people who are aspiring to be in a similar role can sort of look at the career paths that people take?
Yeah, so I've probably had a very unconventional career path to most in my industry. I wanted to achieve two things when I was at school. One was to be a pilot and one was to be an actuary. And at 18, I applied to the RAF to get a university scholarship, and they asked me actually would like to join straight away. So I joined the RAF at 18 and spent 14 years in the RAF as a pilot, flying to AGR4s and also as a flying instructor. So lots of different types of sort of leadership within that role, but always at the back of my mind, transition into finance and into sort of the service sector. So even though I joined at 18 and didn't go to university, throughout my time in the Air Force, I did an Open University course, economics diploma, and also started doing my actuarial exams, and then left the Air Force, or tried to transition to leave the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And I would say that transition was a big eye-opening experience. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be. Mm-hmm. I thought it'd probably be quite easy to transition from being a military officer, part qualified actuary, who had a very keen interest in investments, into the investment world. But I think at the time, a lot of recruiters, a lot of companies would struggle to place me because I didn't fit the typical experience or the typical background of someone applying to join that type of profession. Mm-hmm. So I had to eat a bit of humble pie, and I actually applied for graduate roles. Mm-hmm. And some firms I was still a little bit unsuccessful because, again, CV didn't meet the standard university graduate level entry, but through a bit of persistence and tenacity, and from fortunately meeting a few of the right people, I was able to get a job and start my career investment at WTW. So I started in their graduate intake in 2013, and over the past sort of 7 to 9 years, moved up through the ranks in the investment team, and became a partner a couple of years ago at XPS in their investment team, and now head the Leeds investment team, which is a team of just over 20.
Mm-hmm. So a fascinating journey there, and the typical non-linear type journey to get to where you are today. What have been some of the sort of lessons you've learned along the way, and what sort of kept you going during those difficult times where perhaps you were applying for roles and they weren't necessarily forthcoming?
Yeah, so quite a big open question. I think first and foremost, it's not to be frightened to do something new. Mm-hmm. Back yourself, have confidence, and ultimately, life isn't about succeeding at everything first time. You need to be persistent, you need to get back up, and you need to keep going, because I think to be successful and to progress in any career, you need to make sure you're able to be resilient, and you can take those setbacks and learn from them and think, how can I improve next time? How can I be a better applicant? How can I actually demonstrate the skills needed to progress? I think then once you're in that role, never be afraid to start from scratch. Never be afraid to build things from the bottom up, and to take on a challenge from the start. I think if you do that, you can gain a lot of respect from people who actually see you're willing to get involved, you're willing to prove by doing rather than prove by saying. I think that's really important that people sometimes forget. They're very quick at verbally demonstrating how great they are, but actually, can they actually do that and put it into practice?
And would you say that's a military thing coming to the fore there, not asking somebody else to do something you wouldn't do yourself, but being able to also show them how to do it?
I think so, yeah. I think especially in the line of work I was in, where your sort of direct output is dependent on you, your input, and your success is very much measured on your ability to sort of fly the mission, deliver against a set of objectives. And I think that was the biggest, or one of the biggest cultural shifts from coming from a military background into sort of the traditional professional world, is that accountability, getting things done. And if you say you're going to do something, you do it when you say you're going to do it, as you say you're going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was going to be my next question, actually. What would you say has been the biggest difference from the military world to the corporate world, and how did you overcome some of the hurdles that were potentially in the way there?
So I think in terms of leadership, it's a very different style. I think in the military world, whilst you do have some absolutely fantastic natural leaders, there's still a very autocratic system. It's very order driven. So people will lead, but also when they ask for something to be done, it comes in the way of an order, where that just doesn't work in the commercial sector, right? You can't go about ordering people to get that report done on time, to work weekends, etc. So it's about getting people to do what's expected of them through reward, nurture, people actually wanting to do a great job for their clients and understanding the benefit of doing that, rather than doing something because they're told to do it. And I think that initially that can give a bit of frustration when you're asking for things and they don't come back as expected or on time. But it's adjusting and adapting. I think that's another thing that the military does teach you really well, that there is that old saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and it's absolutely true. It's the best people learn to adapt, and actually when they adapt, they're not always thinking on their feet, which is a big common misconception. What they're doing is putting in place plan B, plan C, plan D that's already been thought about in detail, and that planning that goes behind it. So they may look as if they're being reactive, but all they're doing is being reactive of choosing which plan to put in place. They're not being reactive of forming the plan, because when you're under pressure, when time is short, trying to think of a plan from scratch, it's really hard. But actually putting something in place that you've already thought about, it's a bit easier.
Mm-hmm. I guess it comes down to the old transactional leadership, the command and control structure that you typically have within a military environment, and that transformational leadership which you have in the corporate world, where you've got to take people with you, and they're not necessarily just going to follow. Whereas in the military, if you give an order, it has to be followed. And I think you've talked about two really interesting points so far on adaptability and resilience. Would you say there's anything else which is a really good leadership characteristic that you've found has helped you in your career?
So I think if you look at any time in any leadership or anybody running a team or anything, at times it can be tough, it can be challenging, it can be isolating, it can be lonely, it can be difficult. Right? I think that doesn't change no matter where you are. Having the ability to ask for support when you need it and find that support, I think, is really important. And that support can come in loads of different areas. It might be a colleague, it might be someone you trust as an ex-colleague, it may be your partner, it may be someone completely unrelated to the business line that you're in. But having that support network in there to help you through those times where you might feel isolated and struggling as a leader, I think is really important, because I think everybody at times will feel they need support and help, and it's about knowing where to go to get it, and to use that support to help you to be a better leader rather than feeling isolated.
Absolutely, I would agree with you, and it's actually really fascinating, because one of the key themes which has come out throughout COVID is compassionate leadership. And you've kind of led me nicely into my next question there of how do you maintain compassionate leadership with your teams when things aren't necessarily going well?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing. I think it's been made harder with COVID and the remoteness of teams. I think generally teams have been more dispersed. They haven't been, that sort of team camaraderie has been harder to keep strong. I think during the pandemic, with people working remotely, it's much easier when you're in an office to be able to see and gauge how people are feeling and doing. It's much harder to do that through a computer screen or a telephone call. But I think in terms of compassion, I'd say the best leaders I've had, whilst they've always been very busy, they've always made you feel as if they've got as much time in the world for you as an individual. I think that's probably the strongest leadership message I've taken both through my military career and my career outside of the military, that a good leader will always have time for members of their team. No matter how busy they are, they'll find and make time and make each individual member of their team feel that they're important, and that their concerns, their issues, etc. are listened to and understood.
Mm-hmm. And how do you do that in a COVID environment where people have been working remotely and you can't necessarily feel and do things intuitively? Because, you know, if you sat in the office, you can see somebody's heads down and they're maybe not their usual bubbly personality or whatever, but when someone's the other side of the screen and you can't see them day to day, you can only see them for a couple of minutes at a time, and you only see what they ultimately want you to see. How do you go about instilling that in them?
So I think it's a bit of push and pull. Mm-hmm. So it's probably having frequent one-on-ones or frequent sort of smaller group meetings, but also I think in the virtual world, what's been really hard is everyone's diaries have just gone crazy, right?
Yeah. You
have Zoom or team meetings after team meetings with no break, and sometimes you look at your day and think, how am I actually going to do the basic functions of a human being to get through this day? There's literally no time to do anything else apart from sit on your computer screen. So what I have done is try and put in a couple of hour blocks twice a week where there are open team sessions where anyone from the team can drop in. So no matter how busy you are, that's already built into your diary, so the team members can know they can contact you, they can speak to you if they want to. So they don't feel they're hassling you, so they feel it's a bit easier, or you're making it easier for them to approach you, mm-hmm. Rather than think, oh, I really want to speak to them, but their diary's a bit busy, I don't want to bother them, I don't want to be a nuisance. I think as a leader, if a team member wants to speak to you, you want them to come and speak to you, no matter how busy you are, rather than have to worry about trying to find the right time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it's about instilling that confidence in the team to tell them, well, if my diary says I'm busy, drop me a text message or send me an email, and we'll make something happen.
Yeah.
You mentioned there as well some of the best leaders you've worked with, people who do make time for you. Who would you say the leaders you kind of admire most? And this could be people you've worked with, it could be an historical figure. Who are the ones that really sort of shine for you, and why?
I find that a really difficult question to think of. Who are the leaders that have inspired me most? I think there's always sort of traits of different leaders that have inspired me, from people that have been inspirational to have sort of huge coherence and react. So if you can look at somebody that recently would be seen as an outstanding example of being a leader in terms of the Ukrainian president, mm-hmm. somebody that before the crisis in Ukraine happened, his presidency was seen as not a joke, but it was an actor who'd done a bit of comedy, who then was the leader of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. What are his credentials to lead that country? And I think you can see from how he speaks to his people, how he actually goes and engages with them. He's not frightened from putting himself in harm's way, going visiting people in hospital, actually connecting with his population across all levels. So everybody can connect with him. I think that's what good leaders in the corporate world can do. You want every one of your employees, from the janitor all the way up to your number two, to be able to look at you and think, I can connect, I can resonate with that person, with what they're saying. It doesn't have to be everything, but different bits. I think that's what, if you want to be an inspirational leader, you sort of need to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. How about yourself then? How do you evaluate your own performance as a leader, and how do you know when you're personally underperforming?
I think that's always a difficult question, because if you ask directly your team for feedback on how you're doing, you put them in a really awkward position. Mm-hmm. Right? No team member is potentially going to do what they would call career suicide and turn around to their boss and say, look, I don't think this is working, or this is how you'd like to improve. So I think you want a leader that is approachable, that will take feedback on board, so they know that they can give feedback without reprisal. So whether that means you put in place a feedback system that allows them to do it anonymously or as anonymously as possible, and sort of trends are looked at, and you can pick out, and actually this is an area that the team don't think I'm operating as well as I could do, and this is how I'm going to address it. So I think it helps the larger the organisation you are in, because the feedback can come, and it is by definition more anonymous if it's coming from a larger populace, rather than coming from a small team where people go, it may be anonymous, but there's only 3 of us, they're gonna know who's writing that feedback.
Absolutely.
But it is, you want your team to be able to raise points of concern and say, look, actually, I prefer you to do this in this way because it would be better. But it can be quite difficult for people to do that, because they're worried if it comes across in the wrong way, how will that be interpreted? What would that mean for their career and their progression?
Absolutely. And sometimes the feedback you get is really useful, and actually you can really see the benefit and you can change and alter. But then other times, some of the feedback you get, you think, well, that's perhaps not right because of what I've got to do here and what we've got to achieve. And therefore you've got to discuss it with them and say, well, this is why we do things this way, and try and make them understand as to why you react and work in a certain way.
I would say that feedback bit is probably the biggest contrast from my experience in the military. Mm-hmm. So for those that ever want an example of how to give feedback and how it is received well, if you're able to sort of have a day shadowing someone like the Red Arrows and just go and see how they debrief a sortie, you will come out of it thinking, wow, that is brutal. Mm-hmm. Everyone is honest, the feedback is direct, it's all based on fact, it's not emotive, and it's all done to improve. And through military flying, all the feedback isn't the focus on what did we do well, it's what didn't we do well, what happened, how can we improve, and it really focuses and gets to the point of how can we better. And ultimately the purpose on there is to make sure you don't do something that either makes you crash or crash into somebody else, or if you're on a mission, end up putting your life or someone else's life at risk. So it all revolves around being safe and being the best you can be. But in the corporate world, people really don't like to focus on the negative too much, and they really try to focus on how can we just always just talk about positives. Sometimes, I think in the corporate world, people need to be a bit more brutal about feedback and learn how to receive feedback better, and be more resilient, because feedback people give, it isn't a personal attack on someone done correctly. It's about how can we improve, how can we do the best job possible for our client in this presentation, etc., for the team, and should be looked on in that way rather than looked on as feedback or it's a criticism, it's a negative, people saying I'm not doing well, I'm doing a rubbish job. Feedback should be about how do we get the most out of this, how can we be our best, not about criticising individuals and making people feel things in the negative sense. It should be about people feeling how can we be more positive, how can we be better.
Absolutely. I think critical self-evaluation is something which is often overlooked in the corporate world compared to the military world, where you say yourself it can be quite brutal, and you're just told, well, this is what went wrong, these are the reasons why it went wrong, what can we do to stop it going wrong again, and how can we make it better? Whereas in the corporate world, it is always about trying to find that positive, and people just aren't necessarily used to receiving criticism in that way, and they take it as such. They take it as criticism rather than really as positive feedback to help them improve and grow and get better.
And typically, I think in the corporate world, people only look for feedback generally when something hasn't gone well. If they haven't won a pitch, if a client's not happy, if a report didn't go out on time or not to the right standard, people have a meeting to say what went wrong. But in the military, irrespective of how the trip went, you have a debrief, and it's typically the same amount of time. So even if it's the best sortie in the world, you'll still have that debrief to say, how can we make it better? I think, when was the last time someone was successful and won a new client and did a pitch that they said, actually, we've won that pitch, let's evaluate it, where do we think we could improve it? And it probably falls by the wayside because everyone's too happy saying, yes, we did a great job. But actually, every presentation, every piece of work can probably be improved. And we're probably missing out on being able to do the best job we can for our clients because we ignore doing feedback when we perceive things have gone well.
Okay, so we talked a few minutes ago about COVID and sort of leadership and how you've led through COVID, but how was leading a workforce that was suddenly largely home-based? What sort of problems did that create, and how did you tackle them?
So I think initially everyone was quite worried about what it meant for them. There was lots of frantic work, I think, to make sure everyone had the right infrastructure in place to be able to work effectively from home. I think we were quite lucky in the sector we work in that the vast majority of the team already have laptops, already have the ability to be able to work from home. So from a business point of view, I don't think, certainly in the investment team, it wasn't a seismic shift to be able to get people working from home. But I think initially it was making sure that all the team were okay. So trying to have frequent catch-ups. So we started off having a morning call every day, which would lasted from sort of half an hour to an hour, where you'd literally go around, check in on the team, ask them what work they've got on, how are they, also try and introduce some a bit of forced fun. So whether it's a Friday quiz on the morning, or I think a few times I did Are You Cleverer Than a 7-Year-Old? So I'd read out questions from my son's homework to see if they'd be able to identify which animals were carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore, and various things like that. But I think generally that personal side of trying to pick up on subtle differences on people, and also using the rest of the immediate leadership to chat and see if they've noticed any changes in people in terms of production of work. Are they being a bit distant? Are they not wanting to come on camera? So I think that was one of the telltale signs initially of people who might not be coping as well. So they'd probably not have their camera on, they'd probably be on mute more, not wanting to engage in group discussions, and then just have a conversation with them and make sure they're okay.
I think for me, I found the biggest problem was Teams and Zoom itself, because if you've been on one, going to the other, you could never get them to work or interact and seamlessly come together. It was, you'd use one and it'd work perfectly and then the other one wouldn't, or you'd use one and then the other one wouldn't work, and you just could never get the two to talk to each other. I found that was probably the hardest part during that period where everybody was home-based.
Yeah, and I think it was also getting the team to realise that we're very understanding about everyone's different home circumstance. So I think we met lots of different people's children, lots of different pets, dogs, cats, etc. That on the team calls, people would be homeschooling, children be in the background, and that's fine. They didn't have to worry about that. That was completely okay in that setting. They didn't have to worry about having a perfectly sanitised office, complete silence, forcing the children to sit in and be quiet and not ask questions on homework, because I think it was a big shock for everybody, and especially with with homeschooling, people working in shared flats, shared homes, etc. Everyone had a different set of circumstances, but allowing people to realise that that was okay and remove that stress from them, I think, was quite important.
Absolutely, and I could sympathise with anybody in that situation, because we had a newborn baby during COVID, and trying to juggle a newborn baby and client conference calls and team calls was no easy feat. So I definitely had a lot of sympathy for people during that period. What's the biggest leadership crisis you faced, and how did you overcome it?
So I think I've seen some seismic changes throughout my sort of working life. I think one of the biggest crises that I saw was when I was a flying instructor. The RAF or the military was going through defence review, and they decided to cut a significant amount of frontline pilots, and that meant that all the pilots in the training pipeline, a lot of them were going to get made redundant. Mm-hmm. I think I'd say this is probably slightly worse than redundancy in the corporate sector, because redundancy in the corporate sector, you're generally saying to someone, there isn't a job for you in this role at this firm. But generally, there'll be other jobs of a similar nature in a different firm, or slightly different. And the numbers were, I can't remember the exact numbers, I think it was nearly 200 pilots that they were making redundant in the training system at various different levels. So it wasn't just one level, it was across the board. You're effectively turning around to these young men and women and saying, your aspiration, your dream of being a military pilot has just ended. It's gone. There isn't any opportunity for you to do that elsewhere. You now need to think about doing something different, whether it's to be a commercial pilot or go do something in a completely different industry. So there's a lot of emotions going around of what is the best approach to do this? How do we assess? How do we do it fairly? How do we build a process that makes sure we can justify the process? Because you're talking about fairly crushing and ending the aspirations and careers of a lot of people. I think that was probably the hardest thing to see dealt with, and the outcome of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I can well imagine if you're crushing someone's dreams like that and saying suddenly it's over, it can be quite hard for people, and to really help them move on to the next stage could be quite difficult, especially in that military environment.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that they put quite a lot of support in there, and actually they gave them a lot of transition support into new roles and new sectors. Mm-hmm. So I think that support was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about positive leadership qualities. What would you say is an overrated leadership quality in your opinion?
There's so many different leadership qualities. I think a good leader will adapt their leadership style for the situation they're in. So I'd say the worst leadership qualities are a leader that is quite dogmatic in their approach, that expects everybody in the team to have the same skill set, be the same. Everybody is different, and I think a good leader will realise that you need a team of individuals who have got complementary skills, rather than trying to have a team of people that are almost identical and have a very dogmatic approach on what they want from their team. I think a good leader should be flexible. So any leader that is too dogmatic in their approach, too rigid, doesn't lead by example. And also a leader that isn't willing to roll their sleeves up and get their hands dirty. I think if you're willing to help out the team and almost do the job that is a couple of levels below you because it's just needed to get the job done, I think that gains a lot of respect. But sometimes I think bad leaders won't do that. They just expect the rest of the team to do it. There's a deadline, it's their issue, it's their problem. Well, actually a good leader will say, right, we've got a deadline, we need to get this out. What can I do? How can I help? Rather than you need to deliver that paper on time. So I think that's where good leaders can really help a team and really help inspire a team. And I think if you do that within your team will ultimately pay you back and won't leave you in the lurch at times of crisis.
Mm-hmm. So we're coming towards the end now. What question have I missed? What would you ask if you were the interviewer?
That is a difficult one, asking what would I ask myself about leadership. I think it's probably a question of, do you ever stop learning in a leadership role? And I think the answer would be that no. I think it's probably the military ethos of you can always look to improve. And I think a good leader will always look to take positives from what they've done and also learn from others and always try to be the best they can in everything they do, rather than sitting still and accepting the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And I look forward to welcoming you back at some point in the future.
Thanks very much.
All right, great to have you.
Thank you.